Chapter 2. The Law of Club and Fang. Buck's first day on the Dyea beach was like a nightmare. Every hour was filled with shock and surprise. He had been suddenly jerked from the heart of civilization and flung into the heart of things primordial. No lazy, sun-kissed life was this, with nothing to do but lay around and be bored. Here was neither peace, nor rest, nor a moment's safety. All was confusion and action, and every moment life and limb were in peril. There was need to be constantly alert, for these dogs and men were not town dogs and men. They were savages, all of them, who knew no law but the law of club and fang. He had never seen dogs fight as these wolfish creatures fought, and his first experience taught him an unforgettable lesson. Curly was the victim. She, in her friendly way, walked up to a husky dog the size of a full-grown wolf. There was no warning, only a leap in like a flash, a metallic clip of teeth, a leap out equally swift, and Curly's face was ripped open from eye to jaw. It was the wolf manner of fighting, to strike and leap away. But there was more to it than this. 30 or 40 huskies ran to the spot and surrounded the combatants in a silent circle. Buck did not understand the silence, nor the eager way with which they were licking their chops. Curly rushed her antagonist, who struck again and leaped aside. He met her next rush with his chest in a way that tumbled her off her feet. She never regained them. This was what the onlooking huskies had waited for. They closed in upon her, snarling and yelping, and she was buried, screaming with agony, beneath the bristling mass of bodies. It was so sudden and so unexpected that Buck was taken aback. He saw Spitz run out his scarlet tongue in a way that he had of laughing, and he saw Francois swinging an axe, springing into the mess of dogs. 3 men with clubs were helping him to scatter them. It did not take long. 2 minutes from the time Curly went down, the last of her assailants were clubbed off. She lay there limp and lifeless in the bloody, trampled snow, almost literally torn to pieces, the half-breed standing over her and cursing horribly. The scene often came back to Buck to trouble him in his sleep. So that was the way. No fair play. Once down, that was the end of you. Well, he would see to it that he never went down. Spitz ran out his tongue and laughed again, and from that moment Buck hated him with a bitter and unending hatred. Before he had recovered from the shock caused by the tragic passing of Curly, he received another shock. Francois fastened upon him an arrangement of straps and buckles. It was a harness, such as he had seen the grooms put on the horses at home. And as he had seen horses work, so he was set to work, hauling Francois on a sled to the forest that fringed the valley and returning with a load of firewood. Though his dignity was sorely hurt by being made into a work animal, he was too wise to rebel. He buckled down with a will and did his best, though it was all new and strange. Francois was stern, demanding instant obedience with his whip, while Dave, who was an experienced wheeler, nipped Buck's hindquarters whenever he was in error. Spitz was the leader, likewise experienced, and while he could not always get at Buck, he growled sharp reproof now and then, or threw his weight in the traces to jerk Buck into the way he should go. Buck learned easily, and with the help of his 2 mates and Francois, made remarkable progress. Before they returned to camp, he knew enough to stop at hoe, to go ahead at mush, to swing wide on the bends, and to keep clear of the wheeler when the loaded sled shot downhill at their heels. "Très very good dogs," Francois told Perrault. "Dat Buck, him pull like hell. I teach him quick as anything." By afternoon, Perrault, who was in a hurry to be on the trail with his dispatches, returned with 2 more dogs. Billy and Joe, he called them, 2 brothers, and both true huskies. Sons of one mother though they were as different as day and night. Billy's one fault was his excessive good nature, while Joe was the very opposite, sour and mean, with a perpetual snarl and an angry eye. Buck received them in friendly fashion. Dave ignored them, while Spitz proceeded to fight first one and then the other. Billy wagged his tail appeasingly, turned to run when he saw that appeasement was of no use, and cried when Spitz's sharp teeth bit his flank. But no matter how Spitz circled, Joe whirled around on his heels to face him, mane bristling, ears laid back, lips writhing and snarling, jaws clipping together as fast as he could snap, and eyes gleaming. So terrible was his appearance that Spitz was forced to forego disciplining him. and instead he returned back upon the wailing Billy and drove him to the edges of the camp. By evening, Perrault secured another dog, an old husky, long and lean and gaunt, with a battle-scarred face and a single eye which flashed a warning that commanded respect. He was called Solex, which means the angry one. Like Dave, he asked nothing, gave nothing, expected nothing, and when he marched slowly and confidently into their midst, even Spitz left him alone. He had one peculiarity which Buck was unlucky enough to discover. He did not like to be approached on his blind side. Buck was unwittingly guilty of this offense, and Solex whirled upon him and slashed his shoulder to the bone. Forever after, Buck avoided his blind side, and to the last of their friendship had no more trouble. Solex's only apparent desire, like Dave's, was to be left alone. That night, Buck faced the great problem of sleeping. The tent, illuminated by a candle, glowed warmly in the midst of the white plain. But when Buck entered it, both Perrault and Francois bombarded him with curses and cooking utensils until he fled back out into the cold. A chill wind was blowing that nipped him sharply and bit especially painfully into his wounded shoulder. He lay down on the snow and attempted to sleep, but the frost soon drove him shivering to his feet. Miserable and without comfort, he wandered about among the many tents, only to find that one place was as cold as another. Here and there savage dogs rushed upon him, but he bristled his neck hair and snarled, for he was learning fast, and they let him go his way unbothered. Finally, an idea came to him. He would return and see how his own teammates were sleeping. To his astonishment, they had disappeared. Again he wandered about through the great camp, looking for them, and again he returned. Were they in the tent? No, that could not be, or he would not have been driven out. Then where could they possibly be? With drooping tail and shivering body, very forlorn indeed, he aimlessly circled the tent. Suddenly, the snow gave way beneath his forelegs, and he sank down. Something wriggled under his feet. He sprang back, bristling and snarling, fearful of the unseen and unknown. But a friendly little yelp reassured him, and he went back to investigate. A whiff of warm air ascended to his nostrils, and there, curled up under the snow in a snug ball, lay Billy. He whined, squirmed, and wriggled to show his good will and intentions, and even, as a show of peace, licked Buck's face with his warm, wet tongue. Another lesson. So that was the way they did it, eh? Buck confidently selected a spot, and with much fuss and wasted effort, proceeded to dig a hole for himself. In a few moments, the heat from his body filled the confined space, and he was asleep. The day had been long and arduous, and he slept soundly and comfortably, though he growled and barked and wrestled with bad dreams. He did not open his eyes until he was roused by the noises of the waking camp. At first he did not know where he was. It had snowed during the night, and he was completely buried. The snow walls pressed him on every side, and a great surge of fear swept through him, the fear of the wild thing for the trap. It was a sign that he was going back through his own life to the lives of his forebears, for he was a civilized dog who had never experienced being trapped, and so did not understand this new fear. The muscles of his whole body contracted, and with a ferocious snarl he bounded straight up into the blinding day, the snow flying about him in a flashing cloud. When he landed on his feet, he saw the white camp spread out before him and knew where he was and remembered all that had passed from the time he went for a stroll with Manuel to the hole he had dug for himself the night before. A shout from Francois accompanied his appearance. "What I say?" the dog driver cried to Perrault. "Dat Buck for sure learn quick as anything." Perrault nodded gravely. As courier for the Canadian government, bearing important dispatches, he was anxious to secure the best dogs, and he was particularly gladdened by the possession of Buck. 3 more huskies were added to the team inside an hour, making a total of 9, and before another quarter of an hour had passed, they were in harness and swinging up the trail toward the Dyea Canyon. Buck was glad to be gone, and though the work was hard, he found he did not particularly despise it. He was surprised at the eagerness which animated the whole team and which was communicated to him, but still more surprising was the change in Dave and Solex. They were new dogs, utterly transformed by the harness. All passiveness had dropped from them. They were alert and active, anxious that the work should go well, and angry with whatever, by delay or confusion, slowed that work. The toil of the traces seemed the supreme expression of their being, and all that they lived for, and the only thing in which they took delight. Dave was wheeler, or sled dog. Pulling in front of him was Buck. Then came Solex. The rest of the team was strung out ahead, single file, to the leader, which position was filled by Spitz. Buck had been purposely placed between Dave and Solex so that he might receive instruction. Fast learner that he was, they were equally apt teachers, never allowing him to linger long in error and enforcing their teaching with their sharp teeth. Dave was fair and very wise. He never nipped Buck without cause, and he never failed to nip him when he stood need of it. As Francois's whip backed him up, Buck found it to be cheaper to mend his ways than to retaliate. Once, during a brief halt, when he got tangled in the traces and delayed the start, both Dave and Solex flew at him and administered a sound trouncing. The resulting tangle was even worse, but Buck took good care to keep the traces clear after that, and before the day was done, he had mastered his work so well that his mates ceased nagging him. Francois's whip snapped less frequently, and Perrault even honored Buck by lifting up his feet and carefully examining them. It was a hard day's run. Up the canyon, through sheep camp, past the scales and the timberline, across glaciers and snowdrifts hundreds of feet deep, and over the great Chilkoot Divide, which stands between the salt water and the fresh, and guards the sad and lonely north. They made good time down the chain of lakes which fills the craters of extinct volcanoes, and late that night pulled into a huge camp at the head of Lake Bennett, where thousands of gold seekers were building boats against the breakup of the ice in the spring. Buck made his hole in the snow and slept the sleep of the exhausted, but was awoken all too early out in the cold darkness and harnessed with his mates to the sled. That day they made 40 miles, the trail being packed, but the next day, and for many days to follow, they broke their own trail, worked harder, and made poorer time. As a rule, Perrault traveled ahead of them, packing the snow with webbed shoes to make it easier for them. Francois, guiding the sled at the G-pole, sometimes exchanged places with him, but not often. Perrault was in a hurry, and he prided himself on his knowledge of ice, for the fall ice was very thin, and where there was swift water, there was no ice at all. Day after day, for days unending, Buck toiled in the traces. Always they broke camp in the dark, and the first gray light of dawn found them hitting the trail with fresh miles reeled off behind them. And always they pitched camp after dark, eating their bit of fish and crawling to sleep in the snow. Buck was ravenous. The pound and a half of sun-dried salmon, which was his ration for each day, seemed to go nowhere. He never had enough, and suffered from perpetual hunger. Yet the other dogs, because they weighed less and were born to the life, received only a pound of the fish and managed to keep in good condition. He swiftly lost the fastidiousness which had characterized his old life. Buck was a slow and careful eater, but he found that his mates would finish their meals first and steal his ration from him. There was no defending it. While he was fighting off 2 or 3, it was disappearing down the throats of the others. To remedy this, he ate as fast as he could, and because he was so hungry, Buck was not above taking what did not belong to him. He watched and learned. When he saw Pike, one of the new dogs and a clever thief, slyly steal a slice of bacon when Perrault's back was turned, Buck duplicated the performance the following day, getting away with the whole chunk. A great uproar was raised, but he was unsuspected, while Dub, an awkward dog who was always getting caught, was punished for Buck's misdeed. This first theft marked Buck as fit to survive in the hostile Northland environment. It marked his adaptability, his capacity to adjust himself to changing conditions, the lack of which would have meant swift and terrible death. It marked further the decay of his moral nature, which was a hindrance in the struggle for survival. It was all well enough in the Southland, under the law of love and fellowship, to respect private property and personal feelings, but in the Northland, under the law of club and fang, whoever relied on morals was a fool and would fail to prosper. Not that Buck thought too much about it. He was fit, that was important, and he adjusted to the new mode of life. All his days, no matter what the odds, he had never run from a fight. But the club of the man in the red sweater had beaten into him a more fundamental and primitive code. Civilized, he would have died doing the right thing. But now he was becoming uncivilized and refused to consider morals when the alternative meant death. He did not steal for joy of it, but because of his hunger. He did not rob openly, but stole secretly and cunningly out of respect for Club and Fang. In short, the things he did were done because it was easier to do them than not to do them. His development, or retrogression, was rapid. His muscles became hard as iron, and he grew callous to all ordinary pain. He could eat anything, no matter how loathsome or indigestible, and, once eaten, the juices of his stomach extracted the least particle of nutrition, and his blood carried it to the farthest reaches of his body, building it into the toughest of tissues. Sight and scent became remarkably keen, while his hearing developed such acuteness that in his sleep he heard the faintest sound and knew whether it meant peace or peril. He learned to bite the ice out with his teeth when it collected between his toes, and when he was thirsty and there was a thick scum of ice over the waterhole, he would break it by jumping and striking it with stiff forelegs. He had an ability to scent the wind and forecast it a night in advance. No matter how breathless the air when he dug his nest by tree or bank, the wind that later blew found him sheltered and snug. And not only did he learn by experience, but instincts long dead became alive again. The domesticated generations fell from him. In vague ways, he remembered back to the youth of his breed, to the time the wild dogs ranged in packs through the forest and killed their meat as they ran it down. It was no problem for him to learn to fight with cut and slash and the quick wolf snap. In this manner his forgotten ancestors had fought. These instincts came to him without effort or discovery, as though he had always had them. And when, on the still, cold nights, he pointed his nose at a star and howled long and wolf-like, it was his ancestors, dead and dust, pointing nose at star and howling down through the centuries and through him.